Welcome back to The World Over. With a fiscal crisis looming in the United States, my next guest has gone through great efforts to help balance the federal budget. At the end of March, Congressman Paul Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, released his plan called the Path to Prosperity. It immediately passed the House of Representatives, but not without some controversy, including recent criticism from the U.S. bishops, the Catholic bishops, who recently said Mr. Ryan's plan is flawed because, quote, a just spending bill cannot rely on disproportionate cuts in essential services to poor and vulnerable persons. I interviewed Paul Ryan a few weeks ago and wanted to bring these new concerns before him, and he joins us now. Paul Ryan, the chairman of the Budget Committee. Thanks for coming back.
Great to be back with you, Ray.
Let's talk for a moment. These criticisms were pretty direct. First, I want to start. This letter just landed on the 17th of April. It's already passed the House, your budget.
Right.
It is not going to be brought up in the Senate.
That's right.
Why write a letter?
Well, I don't know really why that's the case. This is to the Appropriations Committee about this year's appropriations, but it does talk about our budget. Let me put it this way. We're not talking even about lots of spending cuts. Our budget increases annual spending by 3% a year instead of the president's proposal to go to 4.5% a year. And so there's plenty of room for prudential judgment, for people of goodwill that had disagreements about what spending and tax rate levels to set on government spending programs. But I would argue that these are matters of prudential judgment for those of us who are lay people in public service. This is not such as a violation of a principle like religious liberty. So when I look at these things, what matters to me in applying my teachings, the social magisterium, are we advancing the common good? Are we advancing the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity, which in my opinion are very connected principles? You can't really have one without the other.
Because they're charging that you're good on the subsidiarity stuff when you're doing block grants of certain programs to the states.
That's right.
Where it's closer to the people, they can influence it, but they're saying, where's your solidarity with the poor?
And these points, these programs that they're talking about, we are proposing, bring them back toward closer to the people who are in need. Do block granting, have more local control. We did this with cash welfare, and we dropped child poverty rates dramatically. It was very successful, but it only reformed one program. There are literally dozens of others that have not been reformed. And so to me, subsidiarity brings solidarity, helping the common good, interacting within our communities to help everybody in need. It brings them closer to the people. If you have solidarity without subsidiarity, then you have big government. Then you have distant government, and you have rank materialism at the end of the day. So but if you have subsidiarity without solidarity, then you can have more rank individualism. So it's somewhere in between, and that's where we exercise our prudential judgment.
The bishops are saying, and this is particularly Bishop Blair, Stephen Blair, who's the Domestic Justice and Human Development Chairman for the bishops. He writes that these solutions require, quote, shared sacrifice by all, including raising adequate revenues. It sounds like he's talking about tax increases. Your take on that?
Well, we propose fundamental tax reform where we don't lose revenues. Actually, revenues increase in our budget. And the reason they increase is because we take away tax shelters and loopholes, which disproportionately go to higher income individuals and well-connected companies in exchange for lower tax rates for everybody, for families and for businesses, so we can promote economic growth. Many other countries are taxing their businesses at much lower rates than we are taxing ours, and as a result, we're losing economic growth. But I still think that that's a matter of economic policy, of prudential judgment.
But they're saying you're taking from the poor and you're enriching the people who are already well off. And you're disproportionately hurting the poor. And these people rely on HUD grants. They rely on food stamps. They rely on WIC. And we'll get into some of those programs. Is that what you're doing? Are you applying draconian cuts that kill these programs?
We're growing spending at a slower rate of growth than what the president's proposing.
Explain that to the
Because we
audience.
want spending to be at sustainable levels because we're going to a debt crisis. Don't forget. 40 cents on every dollar today spent by government is borrowed money, and it's getting worse. And the president is proposing a budget that accelerates our debt crisis. The people who get hurt the first and the worst in a debt crisis are the poor, the sick, the elderly, the people who need government the most. We're preventing a debt crisis with our budget by bringing spending to sustainable levels. But the more important point on the preferential option for the poor, which should not be confused, in my judgment, with preferential option for big government, is these programs aren't working the way they should. 1 in 6 Americans are in poverty today. We have the highest poverty rates since we've measured poverty the way we measure it. It's not working. And so what we want to do is put the kinds of reforms in these programs, using subsidiarity, solidarity, local control, ideas that worked when we tried them in some other areas in the 90s. We want to reform these programs with the idea of getting people off of poverty into lives of self-sufficiency.
When you first wheeled out this plan, and I remember at the press conference and subsequently, you were very outspoken about your Catholic faith and the social doctrine of the Church shaping your view and the way you look at the societal problems and the moral responsibilities of a budget. Was that a mistake?
No, so
politically, given what you're now enduring?
I don't talk about my Catholic faith in ecumenical settings. I do it when I'm on your show or the Christian Broadcasting Network or on Catholic radio or newspaper. Sure. But I do not wear it on my sleeve when I'm on Fox News or MSNBC or press conferences in the Capitol. But I think the key is this. We believe in a society of upward mobility. We believe, rather than trying to treat the symptoms of poverty, let's look at the root causes to break the cycle of poverty. And when we take a look at the programs we have right now, which are spending at unsustainable levels, which will court a debt crisis where everybody gets hurt, let's reform these programs so that they work better, so that we stretch our dollars farther. And they're not working. They're an abysmal failure. Poverty rates today are so high, yet we've thrown so much money at these programs. Why don't we fix these programs so that they actually work to break the cycle of poverty? And if we keep growing government in debt, we will crowd out the civil society, those charities, those churches, those institutions in our local communities that do the most to actually have a human touch to help people in need. That's what we want to empower. That's what we want to improve on.
And there's something I want to focus on. And look, I've covered Capitol Hill for a long time. This is being portrayed. I've read a lot of media reports. These are terrible cuts. Look at the deep cuts of this budget. In fact, explain to people, we're talking about lowering under your budget and the president's budget.
The increase in spending.
Lowering the built-in increase in spending. There are no real cuts.
We will spend $100 billion more in Medicaid next year alone under our budget. We'll spend over $300 billion more in Medicare next year. Food stamps quadrupled over the last decade. We take away some of the stimulus spending, which was supposed to be temporary, and our food stamp levels don't go down to the pre-recession level until 2016 under our budget. Because these programs are growing at such unsustainable rates, they'll crash on their own. They'll have a debt crisis. And so our idea is, let's bring control back to local governments, back to communities, where people who have a human touch, who actually know the individuals involved in despair, can have more control and flexibility. In Wisconsin, we had a Medicaid program called Badger Care, which we can customize to meet the unique needs of our poor population for health care. We want to do more of that, where we don't have a cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all, cold central government approach, but local control, so we can customize these programs to meet the needs of the unique problems in our populations, in our local communities.
How does it make you feel as a Catholic when your bishops are writing letters like this?
Well, I'm a big boy. I understand these things. I've talked to my own bishop, Bishop Morlino, about these issues. I've talked to plenty of other bishops who have difference of opinions with these. Not all bishops agree or are in the same theory. These are matters for prudential judgment. People of goodwill can have differences of opinions on these kinds of issues. There's plenty of room to disagree on how best to advance the common good, advance these principles, the social magisterium. That's for the laity, those of us who serve in public life.
With a certain expertise in these areas.
That's right.
The bishops are making moral principles that they're trying to get society to conform to. But the specifics are really left to the laity.
And people of goodwill I cannot claim exclusive justification for my political philosophy and point of view in economics using the social magisterium any more than a liberal can for theirs. We have difference of opinions on how best to apply these principles to the problems and the policies of the day. It's not as if we're talking about violating a core principle like life or religious liberty or something like that. These are economic judgments where we have differences of opinions. And I go back to my old mentor, Jack Kemp, who said, you can't help poor people if America becomes poor. If we have a debt crisis, people in this country who need government the most, they're the ones who get hurt the first and the worst. Just look at what's going on in Europe. We're trying to prevent that from happening.
I want to get into a few of the specifics of Bishop Blair's multiple letters, and they've gone to several chairmen of different committees in the Senate and the House. They take great issue with what is called here an altering of the child tax credit that excludes, I'm quoting from the letter, children of hard-working immigrant families.
Illegal immigrant families. You missed that point there.
But, well, it says immigrant families. But then they later say, in 2009, 2.3 million people, including 1.3 million children, were kept out of poverty by the child tax credit. They claim here that these children are citizens, American citizens, the large majority of whom are American citizens, would hurt vulnerable kids and increase
this does not apply to citizens. So the reform that we're talking about is the same kind of reform that was applied to welfare in 1996, which is you have to put a Social Security number on your tax return to get your refundable child tax credit to make sure that you're a citizen. These proposals are written for citizens. So it does not deny the child tax credit, the refundable child tax credit to citizens. It simply says, like we do in other aspects of government to make sure that illegal immigrants don't receive citizen benefits, we're simply doing that with this tax credit.
Okay. What about WIC? And I'm going to run through very quickly some of these programs, and they bring them up by name. WIC, the Women's Infants Children Nutrition Program, it's fully funded, they say, under the president's budget. It's $7.4 billion. They believe that under your plan it will be cut and would harm the most vulnerable people.
We don't make a recommendation on WIC. That is up to the judgment of the Appropriations Committee. So we tell the Appropriations Committee, you have $1,028 billion to spend. Instead of the president's budget, $1,047 billion to spend this year. And then they decide how to spend that money on programs such as WIC. So we're $19 billion different, over $1 trillion here we're spending on these government agencies. And what our budget says is it leaves it up to the Appropriations Committee to determine how to finance these priorities. And that's why I think that letter goes to the Appropriations Committee.
Is it a mistake for the bishop's staff to get this specific?
Yeah, because we don't specify those levels in our budget. We leave that up to the Appropriations Committee to use their discretion because they're the experts in Congress on these specific programs. And we simply say in the Budget Committee, you get $1,028 billion to spend on these government agencies for next year, as opposed to the president's budget, $1,047 billion. And then they decide how to spend that. So to ascribe those, say, cuts to our budget, it's not an accurate thing to say, because we leave it up to the Appropriations Committee to decide exactly what money should be spent on that particular program.
Stepping back, the bishops, I'm reading a headline from Newsmax. It says, Bishops, Representative Ryan's budget plan fails to meet moral criteria. What does that do to the public support of your plan among Catholics?
Well, maybe that's the intention, is to try and erode the public support of our plan among Catholics, or to try and drive a chasm in the Catholic community. I don't know what the intention behind such headlines are. But I would say this. Pope Benedict has been very clear about the threat of debt and what it does to worlds, to countries, to the next generation. The threat of debt is basically giving the next generation an inferior standard of living. We know we're risking a debt crisis. We also know that the preferential option for the poor means don't just treat the symptoms of poverty to make it easier to live with. In my judgment, it means break the cycle of poverty, reform the programs if they're not working, so that you can get people from welfare to work, which is precisely what we're proposing. Our job training reforms are designed to get people off of welfare into job training so they can get a new skill and get a career and get on to life of self-sufficiency. What we're trying to go to is back to the American idea, an opportunity society, economic growth, job creation, upward mobility, and a safety net that is there for people who truly cannot help themselves, and then a safety net that helps get people who are down on their luck back on their feet and not trapped into lives of dependency, or as the Blessed John Paul II said, a social assistance state. Remember that in the Centennius Animus? A social assistance state erodes a person of their humanity. We want the dignity of the human person to be advanced by helping people get jobs, get work, and make a better future for themselves and their families.
Representative Paul Ryan, thanks for
Raymond.
being here.
Appreciate it.
That is all the time we have, but the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Go to RaymondArroyo.com. The Twitter and Facebook pages are linked on the left-hand side of the site.